Penny is yet another spawner character who was hard to balance, just like her counterpart Jessie, who I covered in the previous video. Unlike Jessie, who received one balance change though, Penny had her entire kit reworked. Let's take a look at her history and why her design doesn't give her the same resilience Jessie gets. Before we get into the meat of the video, there's a little something we want to mention. This video is our first foray into longer, more descriptive videos. You might have noticed that each subsequent PowerPoint video has increased in length, and this video has had the longest length jump out of all. Our eventual goal is to reach a consistent 20 minutes per video, but we want to know what you, as the viewer, think. After all, video statistics only tell a partial story, and we want to have the best information available to make our videos the best they can be. The best way to show your support and opinion is to interact with the video by liking, commenting on things you like or things you would want us to improve, and sharing the video with other people so they can voice their opinions as well. Subscribing helps a ton with getting content out to more people, and that helps us make more high-quality video essays for you viewers. So please, subscribe. We read all the comments, so this would be a massive help to us. Anyway, if you skipped all the way here, I don't blame you. TLDR, feel free to roast us in the comments. With that out of the way, let's begin the Penny discussion. I did mention in the Jessie video that a lot of those points would be expanded upon in this video. So let's start with the fact that just like with Jessie, this is a great time to be talking about Penny. Penny doesn't have a hypercharge yet, but Jessie does, and despite having many more offensive capabilities than Jessie, she doesn't see use in an offensive, hypercharge meta. But what exactly does Penny do differently than Jessie? Since their main attacks are functionally similar, we can look at their spawnables at a glance. Jessie's turret, named Scrappy, is a ranged shooter that unleashes a barrage of bullets onto the enemy. These bullets do little damage and can't bypass walls, but there are a lot of them. Again, I covered this in detail in the Jessie video, so check that out after this one. Penny's turret, meanwhile, is a cannon named Lenny. Lenny shoots cannonballs every few seconds, which is much longer than Scrappy's cooldown of 0.3 seconds. However, these cannonballs deal much more damage in an area, bypass walls, and set the ground on fire, damaging enemies who step on it. These benefits help much more on offense than on defense, and so looking at just the turret, Penny looks like the offensive counterpart to Jessie's defense. But let's go over the other aspects of her, just so we have a better perspective of Penny as a whole before we go into analyzing her kit. This is something new I want to try, so let me know if it works. First off, Penny is an artillery brawler. Artilleries are well known for their ability to hit enemies regardless of what they're being covered by, since their abilities can bypass walls. For example, Barley can use his powerful attack and super to deny area behind the horizontal walls brawlers like to camp, while Sprout can use its wall in conjunction with his main attack to force enemies back while making sure that only it can attack the enemy. Grom can use his long-range attack to root out sharpshooters cowering behind these same walls. You get the gist. The main defining feature of these artillery brawlers is that they have attacks that bypass walls. But Penny doesn't. Honestly, if you asked any random Brawl Stars player on the street what classification Penny fell into, they would either call her a controller just off the way she plays, or an artillery because it's funny and people tend to remember funny things, or they just look at you strange and walk away. But that's honestly their loss. I am genuinely not sure whether the dev team decided to classify Penny in artillery as a pun, because her turret is a cannon, a type of real-life artillery. But she does exhibit some traits of the artillery playstyle, and it's all because of that same cannon. See, I mentioned how Penny's cannon does about 4 key things. Just to recap, she can deal a heavy 2,400 damage with each cannonball. This cannonball also happens to ignore walls, by the way, so hiding is useless against her turret. By now, the marksmen who hide behind the horizontal walls are already cowering in fear, but it gets worse, because the turret outranges every single brawler in the game in terms of main attack at 13 1/3 tiles of range. And if you just want to dodge the projectile and keep pursuing Penny, the cannonball also sets the ground on fire for 524 damage per second for 3 seconds, so you either get forced back for eternity or lose your escape option. This happens every single time her cannon auto-fires, every 3.5 seconds. Sound like a lot? Well, deservedly, a lot was taken from Penny to make this happen. And to learn how and why this happens, we need to talk about power budgeting. Every single brawler has a specific power budget. This power budget allows them to do things in a match. Pretty general term, but that's because we need to be inclusive towards the entire 80-plus character cast. Think of it like energy points towards a certain skill, where most characters vary in their skill distributions. After all, you can't really make 10 copies of Colt and call your competitive scene a real one. Leon might put most of his energy towards his specific approach tool, giving him more of an assassin role, while Colt might put most of his energy into raw damage. It's hard to measure exactly how much some energy points might contribute to a brawler's viability, just like how it's hard to tell how a brawler will perform upon release without proper playtesting. After all, the best brawler doesn't have to be the one that deals the most damage, or has the most health, although in the case of July 2024 with how broken Frank is, we might very well have that. That's not to say that specialists in a certain area can't ever be meta. Specialist metas are important to keep the game interesting, because they function as the high-risk, high-reward pick that gives the draft pick band format any kind of excitement. The current bounty meta, for example, is interesting because you know that at any point, the enemy can pick a Mandy and completely wreck your sharpshooter composition. So how does Penny manage her power budget? I think it's time to finally look at the brawler itself in detail. For her main attack, Penny shoots out a pouch of coins that travels 8 tiles and deals 1960 damage on impact. That's not the only thing it does on impact, though. It also scatters 4 waves of coins in a cone shape behind the target that deals 1465 damage per coin wave that hits the enemy. The coins cannot hit the initial enemy, though. They can only hit enemies that are behind that enemy. Let's say there's a mortis that gets hit by your attack. The mortis gets dealt 1960 damage, and then the coin wave happens behind wherever the attack hit. So, for example, if you shot your attack from the right and hit mortis, then the coins would spill out to the left. For the sake of this example, though, we'll use top and bottom orientations because those tend to happen the most. If you hit a mortis in front of you, then coins spill out behind the mortis. If there's an enemy right behind him, they get dealt about 5,860 damage for 4 waves of coins. This seems overpowered, until you realize that the 5860 damage only happens when the enemies are practically in the same spot, such that their hitboxes are completely overlapped over one another. Since this rarely happens in-game, we can consider 1 or 2 splashes, which deal about 1,500 to 3,000 damage to the enemy. And again, this only happens when there's an enemy behind another enemy. The pouch doesn't split automatically like Jean's attack. Also, going back to the Jessie video, the most optimal spread for most situations is to take 3 lanes for each player, so the coin wave won't realistically affect much in a competitive setting. I explained this concept in depth there, so check that video out if you want to learn more, but here's the shortened version. Since grouping up can create a weakness to brawlers like Penny who can punish grouping strategies, competitive tends to focus on devoting lanes to each player to minimize the risk of dying. When you split fights into individual 1v1s and then build team tactics upon them such as pinching or support, that gives you a foundation to fall back on in case your team tactics crash down around you. Because of this, enemies only group up when actual positioning is needed to achieve these team tactics, such as when a Doug and a Frank are traveling up the lane together so the Doug can heal the Frank. That kind of situation is the only time Penny can actually use her coin wave, and though it already happens rarely within matches, it gets worse because of the fact that one enemy needs to be directly behind the other in order to make the wave work. If the Doug is aside the Frank and you hit the Frank from the front, then the coin wave will go backwards and the Doug can easily avoid it. So, for the purpose of this analysis, we will treat Penny's splash more like a piercing effect off a single projectile, much like one of Chuck's projectiles. This leaves Penny with an 8-tile, low-damaging, piercing attack. In other words, not very much at all. She only deals 1960 damage in a world where the lowest health brawler in the game, Tick, has 4,400 health. She can't even 2-shot a Tick, something that's pretty easy for a good portion of the cast. You'd think this would be okay for her with a fast reload speed, something like Nita with low damage but spammable attacks. Well, think again. Penny unfortunately has one of the slowest reload speeds in the game at 2 seconds per ammo. This makes her unable to punish enemy aggression very well, as she only deals 5,880 damage with 3 ammo before needing to reload. This, by the way, assumes that she hits all her shots perfectly at a range, so it could realistically be 1,500 or even 3,000 damage. Her projectile speed is listed as 3,400 units, which pales in comparison to Piper's 4,000 units. Or, here's a better example. Mandy has a 9-tile range when not focused, and she also has a 3,500 unit projectile speed. This is Mandy, by the way, a brawler who requires the use of a star power to make her long-range attacks travel faster. Of course, Penny's normal range at 8 tiles and Mandy's focus state at 12 tiles aren't really that comparable in the first place. For mid-range brawlers whose attacks will take longer to reach their max range anyway, projectile speed can afford to be lower. After all, the only thing that matters is the reaction time for enemies to dodge shots, since that's the only thing that dictates whether enemies will be hit or not. And since Penny operates at a lower range anyway, the time it takes for her attack to hit enemies will be about the same as Mandy's unfocused state from a slightly longer range. In addition, Penny does have her advantage in projectile size over Mandy, at 1 tile wide over 2/3. But Mandy has the greatly overbearing option to stand still and gain a range increase, which earns her more time to shoot before the enemy gets to her, as well as a much higher attack damage and faster reload. And Mandy is still considered one of the easiest sharpshooters to approach. It's not hard to understand what that means for Penny, a brawler who is worse in almost every single respect. I'll agree that the Mandy example has long overstayed its welcome, which is probably just favoritism from me, but she brings in an important distinction that truly sucks the viability out of Penny's base kit. Range. Penny only having an 8-tile range doesn't seem like that much at first, because the slowest brawler in the game can still travel at a speed of 2 tiles per second. So it's not like Penny gets disadvantaged in terms of the time it takes for her to shoot down enemies when they're walking straight towards her. She has plenty of time to shoot out 3 shots and maybe reload a 4th one. The issue comes in play during her matchups with brawlers who have ranges longer than her, which unfortunately for her, is a lot of the cast. For reference, the mean range in the game, excluding Clancy, is 7 1/3 tiles. Penny is only slightly above the average, but you have to consider that she has both less health with 6,400 than the average at 7,450, and way less attack damage at 1960 than the average at 2,970. By the way, fun fact, Shelly is very close to all 3 of these aspects, making her the most balanced brawler stat-wise. I just thought that was cool. Anyway, the slight advantage she has in her range barely matters when most brawlers below that range can survive 3 shots from her anyway. And the average damage being 1,000 points higher than her own suggests that most enemies will be able to 3-shot her anyway, because it only requires a little over 2,100 damage to do so. Brawlers above the range of 8 tiles might have lower health pools than her. They typically tend to have higher damage to compensate. Besides, range is such an overpowered advantage to have that it completely overshadows any kind of stat advantage or disadvantage. After all, the best way to survive is by hitting the enemy where they can't return the fire. She does have her Pierce, but that helps only against specific opponents like Nita and the twins, but even they have ways to avoid damage from the coin splash. So we've established that Penny's interactions are mediocre at best. In a vacuum, she loses to every single enemy in the game. Maybe not against a select few, but matchups generally do not work in her favor. I talked before about how power budgets work between stats like range, attack damage, and HP, but Penny's stats are all around bad. She introduces the possibility of multiple dimensions within power budgets, and one of those dimensions is the split between attack and super. The dynamic between the main attack and the super is one that I personally find very interesting and I feel is not talked about enough, since I started with Brawl Stars and branched out to other games. See, for many brawlers, the super is comparable to just another skill you're supposed to use in combination with the main attack. Shelly's super, for example, is just another attack that just so happens to knock back the enemy. Mortis's super is used to chain itself to deal more and more damage. Many assassin supers are approach tools, like Leon's invisibility or Fang's dash, designed to engage and start interactions. But the super is never on par with an ultimate from League of Legends, or a Unite move from the namesake Pokemon Unite in terms of power. And that sort of dynamic did exist, back in the beta days before power creep, with Terra and Jean and their supers being these insane, game-changing abilities. They still are to this day, but they're noticeably easier to charge, and more brawlers have ways out of them. But back then, They were these abilities you had to spend the entire game charging up, and then once you finally did, you had to save it for when the enemy gem carrier was about to collect their 10th gem, or when the enemy was about to destroy the heist safe, or at these pivotal moments. There were two things with this approach. One, it made the game unfun for players who used these brawlers, as they often played incredibly passive with their weak attacks in order to get their super, which meant they were playing with one ability, not two. Spamming the same attack over and over again tends to get boring. The second thing is that it made the game unfun for players who faced these brawlers. Imagine just having a nice day, collecting your 10th gem, when a Terra runs up to you and spawns a black hole, while you are powerless to stop it. My theory, at least, is that these abilities were repurposed to gadgets for every single brawler, and a lot of their brawlers got their mechanical strength toned down in favor of faster charge times. For example, Terra got her main attack damage reduced in favor of supercharge buffs that wouldn't make it impossible to get out of a 1v1 Terra super ambush, but would also let those happen more frequently. Of course, these powerful abilities can and should exist in some games. Unite moves, for example, are great abilities that make games interesting because they can completely turn the tide of battle, but also have to be used responsibly to avoid wasting your power advantage. The closest thing we have to an ultimate ability is Hypercharge, and even that just buffs a specific skill that a brawler has. But it does make sense. Brawl Stars is a fast-paced gun game that trades a lot of MOBA macro strategy elements, such as leveling up and the shop during a match, for micro-strategy elements that are easy to pick up but hard to master, like Mortis's attacks and chains. The best way to encourage this fast-paced gameplay is by adding the current super design we have. I've been dancing around the topic a little bit, but the main thing that separates supers from skills in other games is the fact that supers are only chargeable by dealing damage, by default. This does quite a few things. First, it makes it a necessity for every single brawler to go aggressive and hit shots, because that is the only way they will be able to unlock 100% of their available kit. This provides a cause for interaction right at the start of the match, leading to there being no need for unnecessary macro elements that players strive for at the beginning of the match, like picking up items and defeating minions. This is necessary to allow for brawl simplicity to still be a thing. The second thing this does is automatically separate most passive and aggressive brawler types. The power budget split between main attack and super dictates how much a brawler needs their super. Like, a brawler like Belle might not need her super too much because it's just another attack that deals damage and isn't even a guaranteed kill. Let's assign fake numbers for the sake of argument. Let's say Belle has 10% of her power in her super, meaning it doesn't provide very much value to her, other than being a finisher or a starter to deal more damage. This means 90% of her power is in her main attack. Let's compare that to someone like Buzz, who is pretty useless with his main attack and needs his super to be able to contribute value during a match. Let's say Buzz has 40% of his power in his super and 60% in his main attack. Buzz tends to be more aggressive during a match because he needs that extra jump in power more than Belle. After all, a 60% to 100% jump is more than a 90% to a 100% jump. Both still want to go some degree of aggressive to increase their power by any amount, but Buzz needs it more. Thus, Belle is more passive than Buzz is. And after this entire long tangent, let's discuss what this means for Penny. Penny's pretty weak in her base form. We've established that. Her turret's also very strong. We've also established that. Penny might have one of the highest dependencies on her super due to this fact. She's pretty weak. So right from the beginning of the match, she needs to get her super to do well in any matchup. I think now is a good time to mention her unlockables. There's a build we can mention now that helps her get that super, and there's a build that lets her keep that super. Let's talk about the first one. Penny's first star power is Heavy Coffers. Equipping this star power lets you increase the spread of gold coins and number from 4 to 6. Penny's first gadget is Salty Barrel, and pressing this gadget spawns a 2,240 health barrel that blocks enemy damage. What's special about this barrel, though, is that Penny can actually hit it, dealing 100 damage, but more importantly scattering gold coins as if she had just hit an enemy. Heavy Coffers doesn't really have a huge impact, other than making positioning against Penny's splash harder, but her other star power doesn't really have an impact either, so neither really matter for this discussion. Salty Barrel is really the one true thing that makes Penny so solid as a brawler. Salty Barrel makes it so no tank approaching Penny is safe, because she can just burst them down with insane levels of damage, while getting a free super up on the table. She doesn't even need her damage. Just pick her into a tank composition and you're bringing free value to the table. Salty Barrel also helps as a meat shield for marksman attacks, which is great. The meat shield means Penny can overextend and hit a shot or two that might contribute to her charging her super. She charges her super in 5 hits with her main attack, so some stray hits here and there do really help. And then there's the super. We've talked about both Penny and the super in a vacuum, but together, they actually pose a significant threat. The cannon disrupts positioning exceptionally well with both the initial cannon fire and the burning impact, which Penny can capitalize on with her splashing main attack. She puts enemies in between a rock and a hard place, which is usually the basis of arguing for Penny's controller reclassification. But don't forget about the turret. Penny's the one actively controlling the battlefield, but she does so in a manner very similar to artillery brawlers. And the reason I would still consider her an artillery, even though she doesn't exhibit the typical traits, is because of both this and what her power budget describes for her. The fact that Penny and the turret are equals. Penny's entire game plan is to spawn the mortar or the president, and then protect the president because that immobile turret consists of so much of her power. This power can be increased further with both her first gadget that sends a cannonball at every target within the turret's range, and her first star power that knocks back enemies while dealing 1500 damage anytime the turret is spawned in. The first star power technically doesn't help during the mortar's runtime, but it allows the turret to be used in more scenarios, so I will count that. And with these changes, Penny's turret becomes basically a second brawler. Without the turret, though, she's unable to execute her win condition of control, so she's an artillery first and foremost. She does both, so she's more of a hybrid brawler than anything, but those don't exist in the game yet, so I honestly think she's fine as an artillery. It's a classification that works. Well, after a whole rework at least. I'm not going to spend time discussing the rework in detail with every single stat change and what it meant for Penny, because this video's already long enough. Let me know down in the comments if you'd like an addition to this video talking about those aspects. Though, basically, the rework removed both aspects of what made her such a noob stomper in her previous years. The unpredictability of the cannon and the split attacks. The unpredictability aspect is the easiest to talk about out of the two, so let's start with that. Before the rework, enemies had no indication of where the mortar's next attack was going to land. They had to pay constant attention to the mortar every 3.5 seconds, which proved very trivial for a seasoned competitive player but very difficult for a newbie. I talked about a lot of the aspects that made Jessie so broken at lower ladder, and a lot of them can be naturally extended to Penny as well. Since newer players don't know how to both dodge and attack, sometimes they can stand still or walk in a predictable pattern, and both can be exploited by either Penny or the turret. The turret deals a massive 2,400 damage, so hitting those shots greatly increases Penny's DPS, which is not the intention behind her design. The turret only deals such heavy damage, so people take greater precaution when dealing with it and dodge it more, putting them in bad position to be exploited by Penny. When they get hit by the turret, though, then that just makes Penny overpowered. Anyway, the rework added a reticle that showed where the mortar was going to shoot its next cannonball, so newer players at least knew to stay away from those areas. The second problem is the attack. She had the same problem that afflicted Jessie, but even worse because the coin shower just flat out dealt more damage than her main attack did, rather than the same in Jessie's case. Back then, the coins dealt the same damage as her main attack, so that was changed to make the coins deal 25% less damage. Pretty simple change. And while Penny still performs exceptionally well in lower ladder because of this mechanic, it's at least toned down from what it was before. And again, the problem arose because noobs rushed mid and were stacked on top of each other, leading to coins scattered all over their faces. The rest of the changes were designed to give her a stronger reliance on this now balanced turret, because back then the turret was just too strong in low ladder. Her attack range was reduced by a tile, but her projectile speed was increased, and her health was also increased for greater durability whilst charging super. In addition, her star powers and gadgets were also completely reworked, with one even entering her base kit as the remnant fire after a cannonball storm. Finally, I'd like to talk about why Jessie and Penny see such different lights in the meta right now. First off, Penny received too many salty barrel nerfs and health nerfs that just sent her to the B tier, and this was even before hypercharges. Do keep in mind that Jessie was also in the B tier at this point. Hypercharges just steamrolled Penny. It didn't matter if she was more of an aggressive turretier, because there was nothing of substance to show for it in her matchups. Hypercharged brawlers could dodge her slow attacks and her slow cannon fires, and since they were buffed, they rarely needed an escape option. The thing is, Penny is an offensive monster, but her defense has to compensate. Again, her power budget leans more towards offensive control, not defensive control like Jessie. Meanwhile, Jessie stayed strong as a counterpick option to these, because she was an inherently defensive brawler, something you don't see a lot of these days. Jessie was able to confront hypercharge offenses with her own defenses, slowing down the approach just enough to where the hypercharge runs out and the enemy runs away in fear. Her slowing gadget came in especially useful for this. Penny does have soft crowd control of her own in the form of knockback from her turret, but using the second star power in this way is almost always a waste, because you're sacrificing a better position for your turret to do better things. This is why I mentioned Penny's star powers don't really do anything, although this is usually still the preferred option in the niche situations where it might be useful. In contrast, Jessie's crowd control doesn't require her to give up her turret, and she can use it whenever she's in danger. She also does deal more damage than Penny with her attack, as well as more immediate, undodgeable damage with Scrappy, whereas Penny's turret has its airtime before it can hit an enemy. Despite this, I do think there is some hope. Due to her more offensive presence than Jessie, I can confidently say that Penny's hypercharge, whenever it comes, will boost her place in the rankings tenfold. The stat boosts might not matter too much with Penny's relatively bad standalone offenses, but her buff turret is going to be a formidable opponent for her enemies. It feels lame to reassure a bad brawler with the promise of a good hypercharge, but Penny's kit sorely needs one. For all you Penny mains, I know it sounds cheesy to keep saying wait for the hypercharge, but seriously, wait for the hypercharge, it's gonna be great. Thanks for watching. Watch this video, or this playlist, or join the Discord server.